I'm Noel Cheer. If you think that climate change is the only big problem on the horizon, then you haven't really been listening. This year's BBC Reith lecturer Martin Rees, who is also the Astronomer Royal, some years ago wrote a book asking whether this might be our final century. Well, my guest tonight is a scientist who, along with many other scientists, agrees that while climate change is flavour of the month, we face a range of other potentially serious developments, ranging from water and oil drying up to the meltdown of the ice caps and the World Economic Order. To step us through these risks, tonight I'm pleased to be in conversation with Dr. John Robinson. Welcome to Triangle Stratos, John. John, Club of Rome back in the 1970s, that started it all, crystallised it all for you, I think.
Yes, the story here starts 42 years ago, and it's quite a long time now. I was in France at the time trying to get married, as all of France was shutting down in chaos. And around that time, a number of international civil servants, businessmen and so on, who travelled regularly around the world, were starting to notice the same problem in every city they went to, problems of pollution, overcrowding. They were seeing them everywhere, and they thought this was becoming a global problem. So they set up a group called the Club of Rome.
And in 1972 they published the book called The Limits to Growth, and I guess that says it all, that while we're going to grow, there are limits.
First of all, appreciate that the Club of Rome itself never made any forecasts or published anything. They financed and set up.
Yes.
They found a scientist, Forrester at MIT, who was doing some very good systems analysis, mathematics, and he set up a team, and it was that team who wrote The Limits to Growth, which was published in 1972, and suggested the world is finite, and sooner or later there'll be an overshoot and collapse, perhaps around 2030, 2050.
Were they making that data even at that time?
They were talking in very general terms around 2050s.
Yes.
I think that a lot of the research done since then would bring me to 2030.
Yes, but the actual, although the actual dates aren't all that important unless you happen to be there at the time, but it's the principle, isn't it, that we can't go on producing exponentially in a world that's finite. That appears to be the main thesis.
Yeah, picking up your point that the exact date doesn't matter, it's around about that time. You're doing forecasts of around about because the process has been underway, for centuries, and we're right deep into it. Some of the facts we'll look at tonight show we're deeply into this whole process.
Yes, and we'll look at some of these in more detail later, but the variables seem to be world population, industrialisation, pollution, food production and resource depletion. All of these things are phenomena that you could look at in isolation, but they seem to be converging and adding to each other.
It seems pretty obvious that if you have very few people and a bad crop, you can still survive all right. But if you're pushing at the limits of the number of people that can be supported in a country, and then you have a bad year, bad storm or something, then you just can't feed them. So it does interact, and it interacts further on past these issues to the whole social, economic warfare, and so on.
I guess there's one thing that skeptics might point out, or cynics might point out, that there seems to be a fair amount of media interest in these things, and the media, of course, sell copy, and panic is a thing that sells beautifully. So is there a media enhancement to the problem?
Oh, exactly the opposite has been the truth. In the 1970s there was a lot of very serious research. I was off there in Europe and able to find work with UNESCO, UNU, UNEP, OECD. You know, struggling, but there was interest, and in New Zealand there was a Commission for the Future from 1978 to 1982. There's nothing like that today. We live in a society which is deep in denial. And the press is only picking up a few fringe issues.
Well, if only they're focusing now on climate change, and because climate change is only one of the problems, I think, that you, as I hinted at the beginning, there's a lot of problems, and climate change is one of them.
When I did some work at UNESCO, people who'd been there a long time spoke of the buzzword. The issue of the month. So one year there was youth unemployment, next year was interdisciplinarity, and they come and go. And I think we get this, so we've got climate change is what you rattle on about, but it's just one part of the bigger thing.
But I'm thinking of, for instance, like swine flu and like Y2K and so on, that we got really uptight about all these things, but they kind of came and went. Other things we talk about under the Club of Rome and all the other things, are these problems going to come and go, or are they real
They're continuous all the time, just like the economic problem. Unemployment is now quite accepted, and it wasn't when I was growing up.
Okay, so you know, back in 1972, the publication The Limits to Growth predicted certain things. How much of those predictions have been vindicated by what's happened since?
Well, let's use the word forecast rather than predict, a general trend. There has been a study. First of all, I did some studies myself. We've been watching what's happened. You can read your daily newspaper and see it happening. But there's been a study by the CSIRO in Australia which has had a good look at the forecast and the standard run they did. This is what they really expect to happen, and found the trends are running right along their curves. So it doesn't prove, but it's not disproving.
Not disproving either. One of the major factors, and this has been known for decades, is population growth. And we should have on the screen fairly soon a graph, this graph here that we're looking at, that shows world population. Back at the time of Christ, it's way down here, and it's pretty well flat up until around about 1500, and then it starts to take off, and it shot up at an astronomical rate. This is unprecedented in world history.
Yes, that's right. There has been this continuous growth. It wasn't flat. You have 200 million people in the year dot, 1 billion in 1800. Then you've got 3 billion in 1960, 6 billion in 2000, 9 billion in 2040. And if you look at the graph and just think about it, we live in a really extraordinary time. This is not usual. And if you have a look at that graph and then compare it with the graph of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, exactly the same, shooting up like a rocket. Huge things are happening around us.
So the population is increasing, and we talk about doubling the world's population every 30 or so years, is that right?
No, it hasn't been regular like that. You have a tripling in 160 years, and then a tripling in 80 years, and then it'll phase off.
But it's the base number that keeps going up, of course. So we triple on that base, and then we triple on the next big base above that. So
that's right. So
that's exponential growth.
Well, it's not exponential because I'm a mathematician. And exponential keeps constant.
It's not linear anyway. It's but faster.
Because it's less than exponential, it doubled from 1960 to 2000. Only added another 50% from 2000 to 2040, but it's 3 billion both times. And we're heading towards the point at which perhaps the Earth just cannot support that number.
But in the second graph here, you're projecting forward from where we currently are, and you've got 3 different ones: a red one, a green one, and a blue one. The red one, is that a worst case one? Is it the worst case scenario of where things are likely to go?
It's comprehensive technology, the red one. So that assumes that you can apply technology in such a way as to keep a greater population going, whereas the standard run, which is the green one, just shows that the date's around 2030. It's going to collapse because the ability to feed those people just isn't there anymore, and we have water shortages appearing. They've been appearing for 10 years.
But if we could get our act together and stabilise the world, we could end up with the blue one at the bottom, which is a gradual and sustainable growth. Is that what you're saying?
Well, they said back in 1972, if the world behaved differently, it could haul itself out of this. Now, the world has not behaved. And in fact, this is part of the forecasting that I've been doing, because my question is, what will the world be like in 50 years? And one of the questions you ask is, will people's behaviour change? And my answer is no. A forecast, I came to that conclusion in 1980, completely correct, and it's completely correct today.
So is the red one telling us that if we really get our act together and grow more food and use more fertiliser and use genetically modified crops, we might be able to sustain, for a while anyway, a much bigger population?
It tells you that even if you succeed, it'll sustain for a while, and then it will collapse. So it's still got to collapse. And by the way, it's not going to happen.
No.
We're following I think we're following the standard run there, the green line.
The green. Okay. So all your predictions and the predictions made by the Club of Rome is that something catastrophic is going to happen around about 20 or 30 or so. Worldwide famines and sort of. Well, I start with the model as one part of the input into my own understanding, and then you add
a study of history, a study of economics,
yes,
and so on. And what you build up is a picture that we won't just go up and then it will collapse.
no,
There's a process. The
yeah,
process has been underway for decades and decades. It's like with oil.
yeah,
There were a couple of oil crunches in the
yeah,
70s, which were a forerunner
yeah,
to the present
okay,
oil problem.
So all of this, and because population is perhaps the most fundamental one, is pressure on the Earth's resources.
Yes, can we understand the question we're asking here?
Yes.
We're not saying how many people could live in balance with nature.
No.
Wave that goodbye. That was less than 200 million.
Right.
Way back.
Okay.
We're not saying how many people could live on the Earth at our standard of
Yeah.
living. That might be 2 billion.
Okay.
Pressing. We're saying how many can fit on before there's vast starvation. The question itself is obscene. I think an
yes,
obscene question,
yeah,
but it is the question we're asking, and we're arguing
yeah,
over
yeah.
whether we can squeeze a few more people on or not.
So
We're not
yeah,
the talk is not about
yeah,
how many can safely live.
So why are you and I living reasonably comfortable lives at the moment? Are we living in some dream world afterglow sort of thing of technology?
Well, the story has backed with some of the writings of the 70s, like if you've got a lily pond where the lilies are doubling each year and they're going to fill the lily pond, yes, on the 20th day,
yes,
then on the 19th day they're still half empty.
Yeah.
So that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
We're just about to hit it, and yet it's a bit like boiling a frog. That's another
right
image, and
yeah,
you keep warming it up, and the frog, oh, it's warm, it's
yes,
lovely, it's hot, until the frog realises it's dying,
yeah,
it's boiled.
So that's why in these graphs, this third one with the food per capita, you've got a very sharp peak there, that even with all the food technology applied, we can apparently have a very high population and suddenly it'll collapse when our technology runs out of its capacity to provide.
Yes, remember the limits to growth had all the different facets,
yes,
in it, so that if you solve one problem, you run into another.
Yeah. So all of these models have a fairly steep increase and a sudden catastrophic peak and going over the top.
Yeah, and sometimes the suddenness of the peak would be a feature of the model rather
yes,
than the real world.
Yes.
You can't be quite sure whether it will be as sudden
yes,
as that,
yes,
or we'll get to the oil one in a
yes,
minute.
yes, we're coming to the oil. Just before that, though, pollution. We are polluting the earth. I remember years ago someone saying you can't throw things away because there is no away. Everywhere you throw something, there is somewhere. So we are polluting the earth as well.
Well, climate change is the big one,
yes,
on that, and if we go back to the 70s, climate change was not on the radar.
No.
In the 70s, I can remember the discussion, is the world cooling down or warming up?
Yes.
Or what? Because a lot of uncertainty.
Yes.
Now, since then, the trend has set in far more strongly. There's
yes,
been a lot more scientific research, right, and we're pretty sure now, yeah, that it is warming.
The ifs and buts and maybes are becoming improbables.
That's right. Yeah. In this case, we're moving past the theory to the actuality.
Yes.
You know.
There's been a lot of talk in recent times of peak oil, so I thought I'd look up an authoritative source for a definition, and Wikipedia, what else? And Wikipedia says that peak oil is the point in time when the maximum rate of global petroleum extraction is reached, after which the rate of production enters terminal decline. That seems to be a pretty good definition, isn't it?
It's too simplistic,
yeah,
because stop and think a moment. When you get demand getting greater than supply,
yes,
it is not necessarily that it will suddenly collapse, no, turn over. No. In fact,
you've got a graph here.
Yeah.
There's